So, good morning again. We're going to be looking at a really good passage today in Daniel 8, but like Daniel 7 before it, it's a difficult passage. And before we get into the sermon, I'm going to pray again with you this morning, and I'm going to pray the Lord's Prayer. If you have that memorized, why don't you pray along with me? Our Father in heaven, hallowed be your name. Your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our debts, as we also have forgiven our debtors. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from the evil one. Amen. For years now, I have heard various professors and various historians say that the 20th century was the bloodiest on record. One of my high school teachers, referring to World War II, once announced to my class that modern Americans, they don't realize how close they were to speaking German. I've never been able to forget that statement. The 20th century may have been the bloodiest on record, but we're 20 years into this one, and I'm not sure that we're going to do much better. The wars in the Middle East have certainly taken their toll, and there are many violent conflicts around the world that are continuing to unfold. But it isn't just global violence, and it's not just 2020, as fresh as that is in our minds. Our world is sick. It's an unhealthy place. Do you ever wish that you had the big picture? I mean, wouldn't it be nice to know how all of this is going to shake out? Our passage for this morning is going to provide us with exactly that, the big picture. But I need to clarify that statement. When I say that we're going to be given the big picture, I don't mean that I can tell you how this or that situation is going to work out in your life. I wish that I could do that for you. I can't. Nor do I mean that I will be able to tell you what the future of America and world events will look like. I wish that I could do that for us, but I can't. When I say that our passage this morning will provide us with a big picture, what I mean is that our passage is one that can tell us ultimately what the final outcome of human history will look like. That is a far broader concern than what those other two questions entail. Having said that, knowing what the big picture is will help us to evaluate the specifics of our lives. Our passage today is Daniel 8, which we read earlier. As we work through our passage in the sermon, a theme is going to emerge. As violence gives way to more violence, and as the dark events of human history continue to escalate until they seemingly challenge God Himself, what we're going to see is that when the dust settles, our God stands victorious over all, and He remains sovereign and in control of history. God's sovereign control of events has been demonstrated time and time again in the book of Daniel. In chapter 1, Daniel and his friends are given provision from God in an area as mundane as food. Later, Daniel's friends are preserved in the fiery furnace. God shows that He, not Nebuchadnezzar, is truly great. A kingdom changes hands under God's supervision and appointment, and Daniel even spends a night with the lions, remaining unscathed. I don't mean the Detroit Lions. Lots of people have encounters with the Detroit Lions and are unscathed. Daniel had a rather different experience, but through all of that, what we see is that God is sovereign in control. And our passage is going to elaborate on the theme of God's sovereign control. From a literary point of view, Daniel 8 divides into two big sections. There's the vision and then the interpretation of the vision. While we read the account of the vision earlier, our focus in this sermon is going to be on the text that gives the interpretation of the vision. And I'd like to read that again with you now, beginning in Daniel 8, verse 15. I'm reading through the end of the passage. Here we go. When I, Daniel, had seen the vision, I sought to understand it. And behold, there stood before me one having the appearance of a man. And I heard a man's voice between the banks of the Ulai, and it called, Gabriel, make this man understand the vision. So he came near where I stood. And when he came, I was frightened and fell on my face, but he said to me, Understand, O Son of Man, that the vision is for the time of the end. And when he had spoken to me, I fell into a deep sleep with my face to the ground, but he touched me and made me stand up. And he said, Behold, I will make known to you what shall be at the latter end of the indignation, for it refers to the appointed time of the end. As for the ram that you saw with the two horns, these are the kings of Media and Persia, and the goat is the king of Greece. And the great horn between his eyes is the first king. As for the horn that was broken, in place of which 4 others arose, 4 kingdoms shall arise from his nation, but none with his power. And at the latter end of their kingdom, when the transgressors have reached their limit, a king of bold face, one who understands riddles, shall arise. His power shall be great, but not by his own power. And he shall cause fearful destruction, and shall succeed in what he does, and destroy mighty men and the people who are the saints. By his cunning he shall make deceit prosper under his hand, and in his own mind he shall become great. Without warning he shall destroy many, and he shall even rise up against the prince of princes, and he shall be broken, but by no human hand. The vision of the evenings and the mornings that has been told is true. But seal up the vision, for it refers to many days from now. And I, Daniel, was overcome and lay sick for some days, and then I arose and went about the king's business. But I was appalled by the vision, did not understand it. So in that passage, the theme of God's sovereignty is developed along 3 lines. First, we're going to consider the omniscience of God, that God has all knowledge. Second, we're going to consider the sovereignty of God itself. And finally, third, we're going to see the victory of God. So first then, let's consider the omniscience of God, that God has all knowledge. One of the amazing things about this passage is that Daniel is able to see, even if it's in the form of an odd vision, the series of major world events that will be taking place within the next centuries. Remember, at the time of the vision, Babylon had not yet fallen to Media and Persia. Belshazzar was still reigning. No wonder Daniel was confused. The first power that he saw in his vision hadn't even taken center stage yet. Critical scholars simply cannot accept that Daniel saw this vision when the scriptures say that he did. They argue that this section of the book of Daniel must have been added later. And the reason for their skepticism is simple. History confirms what Daniel has seen. Daniel chapter 5 records the dramatic fall of Babylon to the Medes and the Persians. They are the ram with the 2 large horns. Media and Persia do indeed fall to the Greeks under the leadership of none other than Alexander the Great. Greece is the goat, and that conspicuous horn between the shaggy goat's eyes is Alexander himself. Alexander died young, in the height of his power, just as Daniel's vision records that the great horn on the goat was broken. And the kingdom of Greece was then indeed split between Alexander's four main generals, who are the four conspicuous horns on the head of the goat in Daniel's visions. All of this Daniel saw, and all of this history confirms. What critical scholars can't accept, you and I ought to be able to accept easily. This vision that Daniel was given to him by God. Perhaps critical scholars think that God sees time the same way that we see time. They would be mistaken. We believe that our God has all knowledge. The prophet Isaiah says in Isaiah 46, "Remember this and stand firm. Recall it to mind, you transgressors. Remember the former things of old, for I am God, and there is no other. I am God, and there is no one like me, declaring the end from the beginning, and from ancient times things not yet done, saying, my counsel shall stand, and I will accomplish all of my purpose. Calling a bird of prey from the east, the man of my counsel from a far country. I have spoken, and I will bring it to pass. I have purposed, and I will do it." One of the important truths that this passage teaches us about our God's control in this world is that he sees the end from the beginning. There is nothing that has happened, nor will there ever be something that will happen which will take our God by surprise. God knows about the changing of world powers then. Indeed, he caused it to happen. And he knows about them now. If we believe that this is true, and we should because the Bible declares it, then you and I ought to be experiencing a tremendous amount of comfort. Friends, there is nothing that will happen in the world or in our own personal lives that our God does not know of, that he hasn't always known of. That doesn't free you and I to put our lives on cruise control. Let go and let God. It isn't that. But it should grant us a certain amount of comfort knowing that God sees what is coming and remains in control. In the light of the elections, we can rest assured that the outcome was known to God. In light of the ongoing pandemic and the civil unrest in our own country, we can rest assured that God is not surprised. In the middle of difficult times in your life, whether it's the death of a family member, whether it's uncertainty regarding our calling, whether it's a sudden emergency, we don't have to worry because, man, God didn't see that one coming. No. As God's people, you can be comforted because God knows. But it's more than he knows. God is in control. The second way in which our passage elaborates on the theme of God's sovereign control is by demonstrating the sovereignty of God in a situation which had seemingly escalated to the point where God himself was challenged. Now, a few moments ago, I explained in broad strokes who the animals in Daniel's vision represented, and at least in the case of Alexander the Great, who at least one of the horns in the vision represented. But we haven't said anything yet about the small horn which arose from one of the four yet, and it's that person that our text gives the most weight to. Isn't that fascinating? It isn't Alexander that gets all of the attention. It's another. There's almost universal agreement as to the identity of that small horn who causes so many problems. And that is true because, again, history clearly confirms the things that Daniel has written here. The small horn refers to a ruler from the 2nd century BC by the name of Antiochus IV. Antiochus also went by the name of Antiochus the Great. And at one point, he called himself Epiphanes, which means God manifest. As you may have surmised, he wasn't the humblest of fellows. Our passage has all kinds of interesting things to say about the character of Antiochus. In verse 23, we read that he had a bold face and understood riddles. Verse 25 says that he was cunning. Obviously, given the context, none of those characteristics are meant to be endearing. The way in which Gabriel is interpreting the vision for Daniel and now us, it's meant to leave us no doubt that Antiochus was a tyrant. While it is true that he didn't have the military might that Alexander did, he was a powerful force, and he was militant for the cause of Hellenizing the world. Hellenization means forcing the world to adopt the culture, the language, the practices of the Greek Empire. That was what Antiochus was trying to do, and he tried to do it in Jerusalem as well. If you know the Apocrypha, in the book of 1 Maccabees, it's described how there were a few lawless Jews who wanted to see Jerusalem Hellenized. And in a short time, Antiochus had seen to it that a gymnasium, which was one of the cornerstones of Greek culture, was built in Jerusalem. And that had the effect that many Jews were seeking to undo their circumcision, which was a sign of God's covenant with the people of Israel, going all the way back to Abraham. They're seeking to undo their circumcision in order to better fit in with Greek culture. It was exactly backwards. But the true evil of Antiochus was shown when he entered into the temple in Jerusalem, stole everything that was of value from it, including all of the gold and silver objects of worship, and then he erected a relic of the god Zeus, the Greek god Zeus. He did that in the Holy of Holies. And then he sacrificed a pig, which was an unclean animal, on the altar to that icon of Zeus. And that wasn't performed in a vacuum. It was a military action. Many faithful Jews were murdered in that process. 2 years later, Antiochus sent a large force to exact tribute from the Jews, and while he made an initial show of peace, his true intent became clear. The forces fell on the Jews and they slaughtered thousands of people. That's what our passage has in mind when it says, without warning, he will destroy many. And as if all of that wasn't enough, Antiochus wrote a decree that the Jewish sacrifices in the temple were to be halted. Idols and shrines were to be erected, and everybody was to sacrifice pigs and other unclean animals to the Greek gods. The rite of circumcision was to be abandoned, and the law of God was to be forgotten. And the price of disobedience to any of those things was death. All of this is what Daniel 8 describes to us. That's what is meant when we read about the regular burnt offering being taken away. When we read about the sanctuary being overthrown. When we read about truth being hurled to the ground. When we read about mighty men and saints being destroyed. It doesn't get much darker than this. And history confirms what Daniel saw centuries in advance. It came to pass exactly as he saw it. Put yourself in the shoes of a Jewish person living in the 2nd century BC. If you were a Jew in those days, wouldn't you be asking, what is going on? Wouldn't you be wondering if God had lost control? Wouldn't you be thinking that perhaps God had forgotten you? Haven't you ever asked those kinds of questions? Have you ever been desperate to see the big picture? There is no denying that those were dark times. Recapturing that idea of accordance that we talked about last week, these words become the paradigm through which we understand the tribulation that's coming in the final years of human history. There is no denying that we experience dark times now. But our passage has a tremendous word of comfort for us. God is sovereign. He is in control. Our text, when we read it earlier in the service, made it clear. Let me reread verses 13 and 14 for you. Then I heard a holy one speaking, and another holy one said to the one who spoke, "For how long is the vision concerning the regular burnt offering, the transgression that makes desolate, and the giving over of the sanctuary and the host to be trampled underfoot?" And he said to me, "For 2,300 evenings and mornings. Then the sanctuary shall be restored to its rightful state." What I want you to hear is that these things will not be allowed to go unchecked. Antiochus was not able to wreak havoc for as long as he desired. In fact, God had set the boundaries very clearly. He had 2,300 mornings and evenings, no longer. It's reminiscent of the book of Job. The adversary is allowed to test Job, but there were boundaries. He could only do so much. He could go this far and no further. But from Job's perspective, his life was unraveling around him. Job's life deteriorated to the point where he cursed the day he was born. You have to be in the middle of a pretty dark night of the soul to reach that point. Even so, Job was never told why all of that had happened to him. What Job was given was a glimpse of the bigger picture, the character of God. And that was enough. God has never lost control. God has never forgotten his people. He doesn't forget us. He won't forget you. Sometimes we just need to capture a picture, the bigger picture. We may live in a fallen world where things happen that we just don't understand. But we can take comfort and we can be confident in the knowledge that even in the darkest of times, our God is and remains in control. Our God is sovereign. He is in control. Now, the final way in which our passage elaborates on the theme of the sovereign control of God, it's shown in the ultimate victory of God. Now, to this point, we've seen who the figures in the vision are and what their significance in history has been. And there's an important question that remains to be answered. Does the small horn merely refer to Antiochus Epiphanes, or is there something going on in Daniel 8 which has further accordance? The language of Daniel 8 clearly goes beyond the political historical event that was wrapped around Antiochus. When Gabriel, and by the way, that is the angel Gabriel, we'll see him again later in the book, when Gabriel is explaining the vision to Daniel, he places the actions of Antiochus on an elevated spiritual plane. What Antiochus did is described as rising up against the Prince of Princes. The Prince of Princes is a divine figure. It was his sanctuary which was overthrown. It was from him that the burnt offering was taken. Antiochus took his stand against God. From a New Testament perspective, I don't think it's unfair to say that Antiochus took his stand against Christ. This passage describes this divine picture as the Prince of the hosts of heaven. The New Testament unambiguously places Jesus in that role. On the night that he was arrested, did Jesus not say that he could have commanded legions of angels to his side with a word? In Revelation 19, is it not Christ that leads the angelic host? And furthermore, our passage seems to be indicating that Antiochus was more than he appeared to be too. In verse 24, we read that his power shall be great, but not by his own power. The power behind Antiochus was the power of Satan. Antiochus is one more in a long line of antichrists. This isn't the first antichrist that we have seen in the book of Daniel. There is one in Daniel 7, described in a similar way as the one that we have here in our passage. The Antichrist of Daniel 7 had his beginning as a little horn on a terrifying beast as well. He too speaks great things about himself. He too challenges the Most High, and he too attacks the saints, and he too was destroyed. We don't have to read very far into the Bible before we're introduced to this struggle between a beast, God's people, and God himself. As early as Genesis 3, we see the serpent opposing God and seeking to destroy his people. There is a battle raging which transcends our sense experience. There is a supernatural war between God and all who are opposed to him. Throughout history, people have risen to power who have sought to destroy the works of God. Think of Pharaoh in Egypt. Think of Herod. Think of Nero. Think of Hitler. There was nothing new about Antiochus. In fact, there was something very old about him. And so it will be when the final Antichrist appears. His agenda will be exactly the same as all of those who led up to him. Oppose God, do his best to destroy the people of God, wreak as much havoc as he can. But our passage leaves no doubt as to the final outcome of all of these struggles. Daniel chapter 8 describes it in this way. He shall even rise up against the prince of princes, and he shall be broken, but by no human hand. You heard, I trust, the echo back to chapter 2, in the stone that was cut out, but by no human hand. Antiochus and the Antichrist that he typifies may pose a problem that is too large for the hands of men to deal with. But God is able to deal swiftly and definitively. He will be broken. In the case of Antiochus, a horrible disease ended him. The book of Revelation paints a worse picture for the Antichrist and Satan. In Revelation 20, we read these words, "And when the 1,000 years are ended, Satan will be released from his prison, and he will come out to deceive the nations that are at the four corners of the earth, Gog and Magog, and he will gather them for battle. Their number is like the sand of the sea. And they marched up over the broad plain of the earth, and they surrounded the camp of the saints in the beloved city. But fire came down from heaven and consumed them, and the devil who had deceived them was thrown into the lake of fire and sulfur, where the beast, which is the Antichrist that we spoke of last week from Revelation 13, where the beast and the false prophet were, and they will be tormented day and night forever and ever." No matter how fiercely the battle between good and evil, God and all of those who are opposed to them, no matter how brutal that war seems to be raging, the end of the matter is settled. God is victorious. It is not close. God is sovereign. He is in control. Let's be honest, you and I. There are times, aren't there, when we feel as though we're in way over our heads and things are spinning beyond our control. There are times, aren't there, where we just are not able to understand why on earth God allowed fill in the blank to happen. Daniel 8 gives us the big picture. It's teaching us something about God, and that is that God is sovereign, absolutely in control. This passage doesn't give us insight into all the specifics of life and world events. It actually gives us something much more helpful than that. It gives us the end of the matter. We've been thinking about how our God, how He is omniscient, how He is sovereign, how He is and will be victorious. It was true in Daniel's day. It was true in the 2nd century BC. It is true now, and it always will be. Here's the point. As God's people, we can be confident in the darkest of times because our God is sovereign, in control. Let's pray. Our Father, if it were not true, we would have cause for panic. Our Father, if that were not true, we would have no cause for hope. But Father, you have all knowledge. Father, you have all power. God, you are the one who declares the end from the beginning, and you have always been, are now, and always will be in control. May that truth be like solid ground beneath our feet. And when we face dark times, may it be our hope, and so an engine that drives us. Open up the eyes of our heart that we might see you clearly. And in your goodness, give us your Spirit that we might live in light of it. Amen. Well, friends, this concludes our service. Before you go, let me pronounce a benediction over you. Go in the strength and goodness and grace of our God, who is sovereign and in control. And go in the grace of Jesus, who is our King, who is coming soon. And go in the power of the Holy Spirit and live your life in light of these truths. Go in grace, friends.